There are positions within organizations that create particular form of invisibility, not absence exactly, not literally being unseen, but occupying roles so thoroughly associated with menial labor and low status that people look past the person performing it even when that person is directly in their field of vision. That allows someone to be physically present in spaces while being socially absent from the consciousness of the people who occupy those spaces in more legitimate capacities. Arthur Moss had occupied such a position for 23 years as night custodian at Riverton Corporation, a mid-sized financial services firm that employed approximately 240 people across 4 floors of an office building in the city's business district, where he'd worked 5 nights weekly from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. cleaning offices and common areas while the building's daytime occupants were absent, where he'd achieved mastery of institutional invisibility that allowed him to move through spaces and observe details that would have been hidden or altered if people had been aware they were being observed. Arthur was 61 years old, had been working as custodian since his early 40s after previous career in manufacturing had ended when the plant where he'd worked for 15 years had closed during industry contraction that had eliminated thousands of similar jobs across the region. The custodial work had been supposed to be temporary, just something to generate income while he searched for manufacturing position comparable to what he'd lost, just bridge employment until better opportunity materialized. But better opportunities hadn't materialized, or when they had materialized they'd been in different cities requiring relocation he couldn't afford or hadn't wanted to pursue, and the temporary custodial work had gradually become permanent career that had sustained him for more than 2 decades. The work itself was straightforward if physically demanding, emptying trash bins and replacing liners, vacuuming carpeted areas and mopping hard floors, cleaning restrooms and restocking supplies, wiping down common surfaces in break rooms and conference rooms, occasionally addressing special cleaning needs when spills or other incidents required immediate attention. The tasks were repetitive, required minimal cognitive engagement once the routines were learned, could be performed adequately while thinking about other things or while listening to music or podcasts through earbuds that Arthur wore during portions of his shift when the work didn't require full auditory attention. But what made Arthur's work distinctive, what had gradually transformed it from just employment into something approaching vocation even though he'd never have used that elevated term to describe cleaning offices, was the quality of attention he brought to his observation of the spaces he cleaned and the traces left by the people who occupied those spaces during daytime hours. He wasn't nosy in the sense of deliberately seeking private information or violating confidences, wasn't reading through files or documents that were clearly meant to be confidential, wasn't motivated by prurient curiosity about others' personal lives. But he was observant in ways that most people weren't, noticed details that revealed emotional states and life circumstances, developed over years an almost ethnographic understanding of the small office dramas and personal struggles that played out in the traces people left behind when they departed for the evening. The observation was facilitated by the timing of his work. He arrived at 6 p.m., typically 15 to 30 minutes after the last daytime employees had departed, entered offices and workspaces that still held the residue of the day's activities, coffee cups half full on desks, documents scattered in patterns that suggested rushed departure, personal items arranged in ways that communicated something about the occupant's mental state or current preoccupations. The spaces were frozen in whatever state they'd been in when their occupants had left, hadn't been tidied or composed for public presentation, revealed more authentic versions of people's lives than the carefully managed impressions they typically projected. Arthur had developed vocabulary for reading these traces. A desk covered with scattered papers and multiple open files suggested overwhelm or crisis, indicated someone struggling to manage workload or facing deadline pressure. A workspace that was meticulously organized with minimal personal items suggested either someone who was highly controlled or someone who was emotionally withdrawn and not investing personal identity in their work environment. Photos arranged prominently on desks indicated people who drew strength and motivation from family connections, while photos turned face down or stored in drawers suggested recent relationship difficulties or desire to separate personal life from work life. The trash bins were particularly revealing. Arthur had learned to distinguish between ordinary work-related waste and items that told stories about their owners' lives, crumpled tissues suggesting recent crying, multiple energy drink containers indicating exhaustion and reliance on stimulants to maintain performance, discarded drafts of important documents revealing the iterative process of trying to communicate something difficult, printed job postings from other companies suggesting dissatisfaction and search for new employment. Birthday cards and celebration remnants indicating social connections and recognition within the workplace. He'd started keeping notebook approximately 7 years into his tenure at Riverton, not with particular plan or purpose but just because the observations he was accumulating felt worth recording, felt like they were creating understanding of the organization and its people that deserved external documentation rather than just residing in his memory. The notebook was small, maybe 5 by 7 inches, leather-bound, with lined pages, purchased from stationery store for modest price. Arthur kept it in his work jacket pocket, would pull it out occasionally during his shift to make brief entries documenting things he'd noticed, would write in abbreviated style that captured essential details without creating comprehensive narratives. The entries weren't about names exactly, Arthur was careful about that, was aware that documenting people's private moments might feel invasive if discovered. Instead he'd use initials or desk locations as identifiers. JM, 4th floor corner office, family photos removed from desk, found printed resume in trash. Or, desk by south windows, 3rd floor, found note addressed to herself, you can do this. Just one more month. The entries were observational rather than judgmental, were just records of what he'd seen and what those observations suggested about the human experiences occurring in the building he cleaned. Over time, the notebook had filled with hundreds of these small observations, had become archive of Riverton Corporation's emotional life as experienced by its employees during the years Arthur had been cleaning the building. No one knew the notebook existed, Arthur had never mentioned it to anyone, had kept it as private project that served his own need to make sense of what he was observing, to honor in some small way the human struggles and joys he was witnessing through their material traces. The notebook wasn't meant to be shared or published, wasn't intended as exposé or tell-all account of office life, was just Arthur's way of acknowledging that he was seeing things that mattered, that the invisibility of his position didn't mean the things he observed were invisible to him. Arthur's interventions in the lives of Riverton's employees were rare and always minimal, small gestures that could be attributed to chance or that might not be recognized as interventions at all, carefully calibrated not to violate the invisibility that made his observations possible, designed to potentially help without drawing attention to his role in helping. He understood that his value as observer depended on remaining unobserved, that if people became aware he was paying attention to their personal traces they'd begin managing those traces differently, that his effectiveness required maintaining the illusion that he was just cleaning and not noticing anything beyond the immediate requirements of his custodial duties. The intervention with Jenna Carter had occurred on a Tuesday evening in late March, approximately 5 years into Arthur's practice of keeping the notebook. Jenna was junior financial analyst, had been with Riverton for perhaps 18 months, occupied cubicle on the 3rd floor, an area where newer employees typically worked before advancing to private offices. Arthur had been noticing signs of stress in her workspace for several weeks, increasing clutter suggesting difficulty managing workload, multiple coffee cups left unwashed indicating she was staying late and working extended hours, occasional tissues in her trash suggesting emotional distress. On this particular evening, Arthur had arrived for his shift at 6 p.m. and had discovered Jenna still at her desk at 6:30 p.m., which was unusual. Most employees departed by 6 p.m., staying later typically indicated either deadline pressure or avoidance of going home. As Arthur had approached to empty the trash bins in her area, he'd heard quiet crying, had realized Jenna was sitting at her desk with her head in her hands, clearly experiencing emotional crisis. The standard protocol in such situations was to withdraw discreetly, to give the person privacy, to return later when they'd presumably departed and wouldn't be embarrassed by having their distress witnessed by custodial staff. But Arthur had hesitated, had felt that standard protocol might be inadequate given the intensity of distress he was observing, had decided to make small gesture that might provide support without requiring direct interaction that would make Jenna uncomfortable. He'd retreated to his custodial closet, had torn small piece of paper from his notebook, had written brief message in his careful handwriting, even small steps matter. You're stronger than you know. Had returned to Jenna's area 15 minutes later after she'd departed, had left the note on her keyboard where she'd find it the next morning, positioned so it would be clearly visible but would appear to have been left by colleague rather than by custodian whose presence was barely acknowledged. Arthur had made entry in his notebook that evening, JC, 3rd floor, analyst cubicle, found her crying at desk 6:30 p.m. Left note of encouragement. Hope it helps. The entry was brief, didn't speculate about what had caused Jenna's distress or what its resolution might be, just recorded the observation and the small intervention Arthur had made in response. What Arthur didn't know, couldn't have known without direct communication that would have violated the boundaries of his invisible position, was that Jenna had been experiencing combination of work stress and personal relationship difficulty that had been building for months, that the evening when Arthur had found her crying had been crisis point when she'd been seriously considering resigning despite needing the income, that she'd returned the next morning feeling only marginally better, but that finding the anonymous note had provided exactly the external encouragement she needed to continue rather than to quit. Jenna had shown the note to her supervisor, a woman named Patricia Chen, during morning check-in meeting where she'd planned to discuss her overwhelming workload and her feeling that she was failing to meet expectations. Patricia had been moved by the note, had recognized that Jenna was struggling more than she'd realized, had immediately approved day off to give Jenna time to recover, had also made adjustments to Jenna's workload to reduce the pressure that had been building to unsustainable levels. Jenna had never known the note had come from Arthur, had assumed it was from colleague who'd noticed her distress, had felt grateful for the anonymous kindness, had kept the note in her desk drawer as reminder during subsequent difficult periods. The intervention had been successful precisely because Arthur had remained invisible, had provided support without requiring recognition or creating obligation, had helped without inserting himself into Jenna's awareness in ways that would have changed the nature of the help. Arthur made similar small interventions occasionally over the years. Found an employee's lost wedding ring that had fallen behind desk, left it prominently positioned on the desk where the employee would find it and assumed they'd just misplaced it rather than learning it had been found by custodian they'd never acknowledged. Noticed that employee in corner office had been printing job applications from competitors, made note in his book but also made point of doing particularly thorough job cleaning that office, perhaps providing small dignity to someone who was clearly planning departure. Discovered birthday card for longtime employee that had been circulated for signatures but had somehow been misplaced before being delivered, retrieved it from between filing cabinets where it had fallen, left it on the employee's chair where it would be found and attributed to whoever had been meant to deliver it originally. These interventions were never dramatic, never involved Arthur revealing himself or claiming credit, never created relationships or ongoing interactions. Just small adjustments to circumstances that might make modest positive difference, enacted by someone whose invisibility allowed him to move through spaces and notice things that others missed, whose low status paradoxically gave him access to information and opportunities for helping that weren't available to people occupying more legitimate organizational positions. The corporate scandal that Arthur's observations eventually contributed to resolving had been developing for approximately 18 months before it became visible crisis requiring formal response. The situation involved financial discrepancies in departmental budgets, relatively small amounts individually, never more than a few $1,000s in any single transaction, but occurring with sufficient frequency that the cumulative total was substantial and that the pattern suggested either systematic error or deliberate manipulation. The discrepancies had first been noticed by internal audit team during routine quarterly review in early fall. The auditors had identified several transactions that didn't match expected patterns, had flagged them for additional scrutiny, had discovered that similar anomalies appeared across multiple quarters when historical records were examined. The concern had escalated to senior management, who'd engaged external forensic accounting firm to conduct comprehensive investigation, who'd been navigating the politically sensitive process of examining financial controls and individual employee behaviors without creating panic or destroying morale. The investigation was complicated by the fact that the discrepancies could have multiple potential explanations. Could be intentional fraud, someone deliberately manipulating transactions for personal benefit, though the amounts involved seemed small for sophisticated fraud scheme. Could be systematic accounting error, some flaw in the financial systems or procedures that was creating consistent miscalculations, though the IT department insisted the systems were functioning correctly. Could be human error, employees making consistent mistakes in how they processed or recorded certain types of transactions, though that seemed unlikely given that multiple people were involved in transaction processing. The investigation was generating anxiety throughout the organization. Employees were being interviewed, transaction histories were being scrutinized, normal operations were being disrupted by the ongoing examination of financial records and procedures. There was growing concern that someone would be unfairly blamed, that the investigation would identify scapegoat rather than actual cause, that careers would be damaged by association with discrepancies that the affected employees might have had no role in creating. Arthur had been observing the investigation's effects during his evening cleaning rounds. Had noticed the stress visible in workspace traces, more late nights, more scattered documentation suggesting people were reviewing records trying to identify problems, more evidence of emotional distress in trash bins and desk arrangements. Had felt sympathy for the employees who were navigating the investigation's pressure, had wished there was something he could do to help even though he had no obvious relevance to financial investigation. Then one evening in November, while cleaning office of mid-level manager named Richard Torres, Arthur had noticed something. Richard's workspace was typically well organized, few personal items, minimal clutter, everything filed appropriately. But on this evening there were multiple file folders spread across the desk, all containing transaction records from the periods being investigated, all showing Richard's handwritten notes and calculations as he'd apparently been reviewing the records trying to identify patterns or problems. Arthur had been wiping down the desk surface around the folders when he'd noticed something in Richard's notes, a brief observation about how certain transactions were always processed on Fridays, always involved the same category codes, always were approved by the same secondary reviewer. The pattern Richard had noticed wasn't conclusive evidence of anything, wasn't dramatic revelation, was just observation that certain variables seemed to align in ways that might be coincidental or might be meaningful if examined more systematically. Arthur had made entry in his notebook that evening, RT, 4th floor manager office, noticed his review of transaction records. His notes mention Friday pattern, specific category codes, same secondary approver. Might be relevant to audit investigation. The entry was longer than Arthur's typical brief observations, reflected his sense that this might actually be important, that the pattern Richard had noticed might provide investigative direction that the formal auditors were missing. But Arthur had no obvious mechanism for communicating this observation to the investigation team. He couldn't just approach the auditors or senior management. His position as night custodian meant his observations wouldn't be taken seriously, might even be dismissed as inappropriate intrusion into matters beyond his role. He needed an indirect way to ensure Richard's observation received attention it deserved without revealing his own involvement. He'd decided to do something he'd never done before, to deliberately arrange Richard's workspace to make the relevant notes more prominent. Had carefully repositioned the file folders so that the page containing Richard's observation about the Friday pattern was on top of the stack, clearly visible, positioned exactly where Richard would see it immediately upon arriving the next morning. Had hoped that seeing his own notes positioned prominently might prompt Richard to share the observation with the investigation team, might create pathway for the insight to reach people who could act on it without requiring Arthur to violate his invisible position. The strategy had worked. Richard had noticed the repositioned notes the next morning, had assumed he'd left them that way himself though he had vague sense he hadn't, had decided to email the observation to the lead investigator since it was positioned so prominently in his workspace. The investigator had followed up on the pattern Richard had identified, had discovered that the Friday transactions Richard had noticed were being processed through particular workflow that had accounting quirk, not fraud, not intentional manipulation, just systematic error in how the software calculated certain overhead allocations when transactions were processed late on Friday afternoons before weekly system maintenance. The discovery had resolved the investigation. The discrepancies were result of software bug rather than human error or fraud, could be corrected retroactively once the pattern was identified, didn't require disciplining or terminating anyone. The resolution had been enormous relief to the organization, had eliminated the anxiety about potential fraud, had prevented unfair blame from falling on innocent employees, had allowed operations to return to normal without the cloud of investigation hanging over daily work. Arthur had made brief entry in his notebook. Audit investigation resolved. Software issue, not fraud. RT's observation helped investigators identify the pattern. Glad it worked out. The entry didn't claim credit, didn't emphasize Arthur's role in ensuring Richard's observation reached the investigators, just recorded satisfaction that the situation had been resolved without harm to employees who'd been worried about being blamed. Over the 23 years Arthur worked as night custodian at Riverton, the notebook filled with similar observations and small interventions. None were dramatic, None involved Arthur becoming visible or claiming recognition, none created ongoing relationships or changed his fundamental position within the organization's social hierarchy. Just accumulated small moments of noticing and occasionally helping, documented in abbreviated entries that served primarily as Arthur's own record of the human life he was witnessing in the building he cleaned. The notebook became an artifact of organizational memory that existed nowhere else. Recorded things that would otherwise have been lost, the anxiety of employees facing performance reviews, the joy of promotions and celebrations, the grief of personal losses that people brought to work and tried to manage while maintaining professional composure. The gradual evolution of relationships and careers that played out over months and years in ways that were visible to someone who was present consistently but that weren't captured in any official record. Arthur learned employees' stories without the employees knowing he was learning them. Knew who was struggling with fertility treatments based on medical appointment reminders left on desks and emotional patterns visible in workspace organization. Knew who was caring for aging parents based on family photos and occasional personal calls that Arthur would overhear while cleaning adjacent areas. Knew who was facing financial stress based on debt collection notices in mail that arrived at office, who was experiencing relationship difficulties based on couples therapy appointment cards left visible, who was job searching based on updated resumes found in printer trays. The knowledge was intimate without being intrusive. Arthur never sought this information deliberately, never read private documents or communications that were clearly meant to be confidential, never violated the ethical boundaries that should constrain even invisible observers. But the information revealed itself through the material traces people left, through the ways their personal lives manifested in their workspaces despite their attempts to maintain separation between personal and professional domains. And occasionally, rarely, maybe once or twice a year across the 23 years, Arthur would make small intervention that might help. Would leave anonymous encouraging note for someone who was clearly struggling. Would retrieve and return lost item that had personal significance. Would ensure that something important that had been overlooked or misplaced would be found by the person who needed it. Would make small adjustment to environment that might provide comfort or support without requiring recognition of his role in providing it. The interventions weren't about Arthur being hero or savior. Weren't motivated by desire for recognition or by belief that he could solve people's problems. Were just small gestures of care enacted by someone whose position allowed him to notice things and who felt that noticing created some small obligation to help when helping was possible without violating the boundaries that made his observation possible. Were Arthur's way of acknowledging that the people whose workspaces he cleaned were humans experiencing difficulties and joys that deserved witnessing even if that witnessing remained invisible. Arthur retired in June at age 61, earlier than he'd originally planned but after a minor health scare had made him reconsider how he wanted to spend his remaining active years. The retirement was announced through standard company communication, brief email from HR acknowledging his years of service and wishing him well in retirement, inviting employees to contribute to retirement card that would be presented at small reception in the break room on his final day. The reception was modestly attended, perhaps 20 employees, mostly facilities staff and HR personnel who directly interacted with Arthur over the years, plus handful of long-tenured employees who made practice of attending these retirement events regardless of how well they knew the retiree. The gathering was brief, featured standard retirement cake and punch, included brief speeches from facilities manager and HR director thanking Arthur for his reliable service and dedication. No one mentioned the notebook. No one spoke about the observations Arthur had been making or the small interventions he'd enacted. No one knew, how could they know, that Arthur had been documenting their lives in careful entries over 23 years, that he'd been witness to their struggles and celebrations, that he'd occasionally helped in ways they'd never recognized as help. The retirement reception treated Arthur as he'd always been treated, as competent custodian who'd performed necessary but unglamorous labor, whose departure would be covered by hiring replacement custodian who would perform the same functions, whose individual presence would be quickly forgotten by organization that had never really seen him in first place. Arthur had brought the notebook to his final shift, had made final entry on his last night at Riverton. 23 years of observing, occasionally helping. The building will continue without me. The people will continue their lives. I'm grateful I got to witness their humanity, even if they never knew I was witnessing. Had closed the notebook, had placed it in his bag to take home, had finished his cleaning duties with same careful attention he'd brought to them for 23 years. The notebook went home with Arthur, was placed on shelf in his small apartment, remained there as private archive of experiences that had no public relevance but that had significant personal meaning to Arthur as record of how he'd spent more than 2 decades of his working life. He occasionally paged through it during his early retirement, would read entries from years earlier, would remember the people and situations those abbreviated notes documented, would feel satisfaction that he'd been part of their lives even if his part had been invisible. At Riverton, Arthur's absence was barely noticed beyond the facilities department that had to coordinate his replacement. The new night custodian performed the same duties adequately if without Arthur's particular attentiveness, cleaned the same spaces following the same routines, maintained the building's cleanliness to same standards Arthur had maintained. The organization continued functioning exactly as it had functioned, the employees continued experiencing their various struggles and successes, the daily operations proceeded without any visible disruption from Arthur's departure. But small traces of Arthur's influence remained, invisible legacies that persisted without attribution or recognition. Jenna Carter, now promoted to senior analyst role, still kept the anonymous note in her desk drawer, still drew strength from it during difficult periods, still wondered occasionally about who had left it but had long ago accepted she'd never know. Richard Torres, who'd been promoted to director role partly based on his contribution to resolving the audit investigation, occasionally wondered how his notes about the Friday pattern had ended up positioned so prominently that morning but had attributed it to his own absent-minded organization rather than to deliberate intervention. Other employees whose lives Arthur had touched in small ways, the person whose lost wedding ring had mysteriously reappeared, the birthday celebrant whose misplaced card had been found and delivered, the struggling employee who'd found encouraging note at exactly the moment when encouragement was needed, continued their lives carrying small positive impacts whose sources they couldn't identify, whose existence they attributed to luck or coincidence or to kindness from colleagues they could no longer identify. The accumulated effect of Arthur's 23 years of observation and occasional intervention was diffuse, distributed across dozens of people and hundreds of small moments, impossible to measure or quantify but nonetheless real. Had created slightly more humane organizational environment than would have existed without his attentive presence, had provided small supports to people who needed them, had occasionally prevented harm or enabled good outcomes through subtle interventions that remained invisible even as their effects persisted. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they just notice. Sometimes the most significant contributions to organizational life come from people occupying positions society deems menial, from observers whose low status paradoxically gives them access to information and opportunities for helping that aren't available to people occupying more prestigious roles, from individuals whose invisibility allows them to witness authentic human experience that's hidden from official view. Arthur's story isn't about custodial work specifically being uniquely valuable or about low-status positions being secretly more important than high-status ones. It's about the value of attention, of observation, of caring enough to notice what's happening around you and to occasionally act on that noticing in ways that might help even when helping won't be recognized or rewarded. Those qualities can be exercised from any position, can be practiced by anyone regardless of their formal role or status, can create positive impacts that accumulate across time even when individual impacts are small and invisible. The notebook Arthur kept wasn't necessary for his impact, was just his personal way of honoring what he was witnessing, of creating external record of observations that mattered to him even though they'd never be shared. But the practice of systematic observation that the notebook represented, the discipline of paying attention and documenting what he noticed, created deeper engagement with the human lives playing out around him than he'd have achieved through casual noticing alone. So consider developing your own practice of attention and observation. Not necessarily through literal notebook, not necessarily through Arthur's specific methods, but through cultivating capacity to notice what's happening around you, to see beyond surface presentations to underlying human experiences, to recognize when small gestures might provide support or help without requiring recognition. The specific form matters less than the underlying commitment to paying attention, to caring about what you observe, to occasionally acting on that caring in ways that might create small positive impacts. And if you occupy a position that society considers menial or low status, know that your position might provide access to information and opportunities that aren't available to people with more prestigious roles. That invisibility can be a form of power when used to observe and occasionally help without seeking recognition. That the impact you create through attentive care might be more significant than the impact created by people occupying positions that receive more formal acknowledgement. Arthur's 23 years of custodial work at Riverton created legacy that persists in dozens of small ways that can't be traced to their source, that improved lives and prevented harms through interventions that remained invisible even as their effects accumulated. The legacy wasn't about Arthur being exceptional person or saint, was just about him being attentive observer who occasionally acted on what he noticed in ways that might help. That level of care and attention is available to anyone willing to practice it, regardless of their position or status, regardless of whether their contributions will ever be recognized or acknowledged. Be observant, be kind, and record life's quiet truths, even if only in your own awareness. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they just notice. Be StoryWise.